I caught my wife at a hidden party in the city. It wasn't one of those casual meetings, but rather an intimate meeting, where the glances exchanged had a meaning far beyond what I could imagine. She was there, in the crowd, laughing, completely at ease, until our eyes met. The moment he saw me, the smile disappeared from his face as if it had been erased by an invisible hand. She froze, unresponsive, as if the world around her had stopped. At that moment, something inside me broke, but what torments me most is not the fact that I saw her there. No. The real hell began when I started connecting the pieces that were scattered throughout our marriage. Little details, moments that had once seemed insignificant, now screamed at me, revealing a dark truth. I always thought our life was almost perfect, a happy family, a welcoming home. But the last few months had been different. There was something about the way she looked away, the excuses that seemed weak, the distance that grew between us. I convinced myself that I was being paranoid, that it was just the stress of work, the routine that wears on any relationship. But now, in front of that scene, everything made sense. It wasn't stress, it wasn't tiredness. It was treason. And not just any betrayal. Something much deeper, more cruel. Because, seeing her there, surrounded by those who clearly knew more than me, I understood that this wasn't the first time. She had a secret life, one I never imagined, a life that destroyed everything we had built together. What followed was a mixture of anger, pain and an insatiable desire to discover the truth. The pain of knowing that I was the last to realize what was happening, the shame of having been deceived for so long, and the hatred for those who covered their steps. I needed to know more. She needed to understand what led her there, what was really happening behind appearances. Because deep down, I knew there was something even deeper, more devastating to discover. As I tried to process it all, one question repeated itself over and over in my mind: what else was being hidden from me? And, more importantly, what would I do when I knew the answer? In silent and welcoming Philadelphia, where the cobblestone streets and old mansions exude history, there lived a couple who, in everyone's eyes, seemed to have it all. Richard, a renowned lawyer known for his impeccable ethics and commitment to the truth, was the kind of man who took both his work and his family seriously. Since meeting Emily, his wife, he has dedicated himself to building a solid home, full of affection and respect. Emily, in turn, was the picture of social perfection, beautiful, charismatic, devoted mother and attentive wife. Together, they formed the ideal couple, the one that everyone admired and envied. But like many fairy tales, there was something rotten beneath the shiny surface. The house they lived in, located in one of the most desirable areas of the city, reflected the stability that Richard had always sought. An impeccable garden, flowers carefully cultivated by Emily, and an internal environment that mixed traditional with modern, creating a feeling of comfort and elegance. That house was a refuge for Richard after long days in court, a place where he felt protected from the outside world. However, over the past few months, Richard has started to notice subtle changes in Emily. Small details that he previously ignored began to catch his attention. First, there were the calls she made when she thought he wasn't around. Low voice, words chosen carefully, as if each sentence hid something that should not be revealed. Then came the increasingly frequent outings for meetings with friends, or trips to the mall, which became longer and less explained. At first, he tried to dispel suspicion. He didn't want to believe that the woman he loved, the mother of his son, could be hiding something from him. Emily, on the other hand, seemed to have changed in more ways than one. Before, always present at home, now she seemed restless, distracted, as if her mind was constantly somewhere else. Her attention to her son, Jack, just 4 years old, remained the same, but there was a growing distance between her and Richard. Conversations that used to flow naturally became monotonous, full of awkward silences. Richard tried to break the ice, talking about work and current affairs, but Emily responded mechanically, as if she were fulfilling an obligation. Philadelphia, with its busy streets and historic atmosphere, was the perfect backdrop for the love story Richard always believed he was living. He grew up there, knew every corner, every monument. It was in the city that he felt safe, confident. But lately, even the streets he knew so well seemed different, as if they hid secrets within their shadows. Emily was also a daughter of Philadelphia, and together, they believed they would build a solid history, as sturdy as the ancient buildings that surrounded the city. The change in Emily coincided with the arrival of a new person in her life, Amanda, a classmate from the book club Emily attended. Amanda was the opposite of Emily, extroverted, always the center of attention, with behavior that bordered on extravagant. Since the two became closer, Richard noticed that Emily started acting differently. She, who had previously valued simplicity and intimacy, now seemed more interested in going out and socializing with strangers, an unusual behavior for her. Richard, however, attributed this change to Amanda's influence. He tried to convince himself that it was just a phase, something that would pass. But as time passed, the feeling that something was terribly wrong grew within him. There were nights when he would wake up and find Emily's side of the bed empty. She said she was in the living room, reading or watching television, but the expression on her face always betrayed tension, as if she were hiding something. While Richard tried to maintain his sanity and focus on work, Emily seemed increasingly distant. His kisses were less frequent, his hugs colder. Even discussions, which used to happen for silly reasons, like choosing a movie or the color of a wall, have become rare. There was no longer that connection between them, that complicity that had always defined their relationship. To Richard, it was as if an invisible chasm had opened between them, and he didn't know how or when it had started. Jack, innocent and oblivious to the tension between his parents, continued to be the point of light in Richard's life. But even there, something bothered him. Emily, who had always been a dutiful mother, seemed to be losing interest in certain aspects of Jack's life. There were moments when she looked at the boy with an expression that was difficult to decipher, something between guilt and sadness. Richard noticed, but didn't dare question her. There was something about Emily that made him hesitate, a fear that if he asked too much he might discover a truth he wasn't prepared to face. The weeks passed, and Richard's doubts only grew. He began to notice patterns, little coincidences that had previously eluded him. Emily's schedule, her excuses, her new circle of friends, everything seemed to conspire against him. Then, one rainy afternoon, while he was reviewing documents in his home office, he found a note in Emily's coat pocket. It was a reminder of an 8 p.m. date. There was no name, no location, just a time. And it was then that Richard decided to follow her that night. He didn't know what he expected to find, but his instinct told him that that note was the key to understanding what was happening. What Richard didn't know was that that night would be the beginning of a journey of discovery, pain and revelations that would forever change his and his family's lives. By following Emily through the streets of Philadelphia, Richard wasn't just looking for answers, he was about to confront a truth that would make him question everything he believed about his marriage, his wife, and even himself. That night, when Emily said she was going out for another one of her meetings, Richard knew there was no going back. He was determined to follow his wife, to discover the truth that had haunted him for so long. The clock seemed to tick slower as he waited for her to leave. When he finally saw her walk through the door, dressed more elaborately than usual, he waited a few minutes and followed after her, keeping enough distance so as not to be noticed. The sky over Philadelphia was overcast, foreboding a storm, but Richard barely noticed the weather. His mind was in a whirl, trying to predict what he might find. Emily walked quickly, head down, almost as if she wanted to avoid being seen. When she finally stopped in front of an inconspicuous building with no obvious markings, Richard recognized the place by sight. It was a private club, known for attracting those seeking discretion, where exclusive parties took place away from prying eyes. He waited until she entered before following, taking deep breaths to contain his anxiety. Upon entering the doors, Richard was immediately overcome by a feeling of discomfort. The environment was sophisticated, but carried an aura of something forbidden, as if everyone there was hiding something. There was soft music, muffled laughter, and a feeling that time flowed differently in this place. Emily was there, surrounded by people Richard had never seen before. There was an intimacy between them, as if they were longtime friends. He watched her from afar, trying to understand what she was doing. Her every gesture, her every laugh, seemed disconnected from the woman he knew. The atmosphere was charged, and the feeling of betrayal grew with every second he remained there. Richard realized that there was something wrong in that environment. People exchanged complicit glances, whispered among themselves, and he felt that his presence there would soon be noticed. But before he could make up his mind about what to do, something unexpected happened. Emily was led to a more private area of the club, and Richard followed her with as much discretion as possible. There, he saw her being greeted by a man who seemed to be the center of attention. They exchanged few words before Emily was taken to a second floor, where the lights were dimmer and the music quieter. Richard moved forward, his heart pounding, trying to understand what was about to happen. When he finally reached the stairs, he was faced with a situation that left him paralyzed. Emily stood before the man, laughing at something he had said, and when Richard saw that man's face, his world seemed to fall apart. It was someone he knew, someone he would never imagine being involved with his wife. The two seemed intimate, as if they had a history together. The closeness between them was undeniable. The man touched Emily's face with a familiarity that made Richard feel an anger he didn't know he was capable of feeling. He wanted to confront them right then, but something stopped him. He knew he needed more information before acting, he needed to be sure of what was happening before accusing Emily. So he continued to watch them, fighting the urge to intervene. As the minutes dragged on, Richard began to notice something even more disturbing. The conversation between Emily and the man seemed to focus on a specific topic, a secret that they both shared and that Richard, until then, was unaware of. They talked about someone, a third person, in an enigmatic way. Each mention made Richard's blood run cold, until he finally understood what it was about. The person they talked about, so carefully, was Jack, their son. Suddenly, everything started to fall into place in a cruel way. Emily's distance, the nights when she seemed distant even from Jack, the empty excuses. Richard realized that the secret she was hiding wasn't just related to physical betrayal. There was something much deeper at play, something that could destroy not just their marriage, but their entire family. Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Confirmation of what he feared seemed imminent, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. But at the same time, he knew he needed to remain calm, that it wasn't time to act yet. He silently withdrew, trying to assimilate what he had discovered and planning his next move. I knew the worst was yet to come, and I needed to be prepared for whatever it was. When Richard left the club that night, he looked different. The man who had entered there, full of suspicion and uncertainty, now left with a conviction that would haunt him forever. What he discovered that night was just the beginning of a truth that was about to be revealed, a truth that he knew would change everything. Driving home, Richard couldn't get the words he'd heard, the images he'd witnessed out of his mind. Something inside him already knew what the terrible truth would come to light, but part of him still refused to accept it. He needed proof, needed to confront Emily in a way that she couldn't deny what she was hiding. And above all, he needed to understand how all of this had happened before his own eyes, without him noticing. Richard didn't know what his next meeting with Emily would be like, but he knew that nothing would be the same as before. What he had witnessed at the club was the prelude to a revelation he feared more than anything. And what he was about to discover would test all the limits of his sanity and his love. The morning after the silent confrontation at the club, Richard woke up with a weight on his chest, as if the revelation that awaited him was pressing on every fiber of his being. Emily was in the kitchen, preparing coffee as she did every day, as if nothing had changed. But for Richard, everything had changed. He watched her from afar, her every movement seemed charged with a hidden intention that he still needed to decipher. The naturalness with which she followed her routine was almost an affront to the turmoil that was forming inside him. Determined to find the final proof he was looking for, Richard took advantage of the moment Emily went for a walk with Jack to look through his belongings. There was something in her eyes last night that indicated she was hiding more than just suspicious encounters. At the bottom of a drawer, among old papers and forgotten letters, he found a yellowed envelope, with a name he didn't recognize. His hands shook as he opened the envelope, and the contents he found inside were devastating: a paternity test. The test, carried out shortly after Jack's birth, brought a clear and cruel result: Richard was not the biological father. The revelation hit Richard like a blow to the stomach, knocking the air from his lungs. Everything he believed in, his entire life, crumbled before that piece of paper. Anger boiled in his veins, mixed with a deep, paralyzing pain. How could Emily keep such a destructive secret for so long? How could she look at him and Jack every day, knowing it was all a lie? When Emily returned with Jack, the tension in the air was palpable. Richard waited for the boy to go to his room before confronting her. He was about to start a conversation that he knew would change their lives forever, but there was no way to avoid it. With the envelope in hand, he entered the room where Emily was, and when she showed the test, her eyes filled with tears. "You're going to explain this to me now," Richard demanded, his voice cool and controlled despite the whirlwind of emotions consuming him. Emily looked at the paper in her hands and immediately knew that there was no longer any escape. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. Richard stared at her with an intensity she had never seen before. After a silence that seemed to last an eternity, she finally murmured, "Richard, I can explain." "Explain? How can you explain it? How can you justify lying like that for so long?" He could barely contain his fury. "I'm not Jack's father." "Who is, Emily? Who is my son's real father?" Tears streamed down Emily's face as she tried to find the right words. "I never wanted this to happen. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. But Jack, he's our son, Richard. Regardless of what this test says, you were always his father." "A mistake?" Richard repeated, incredulously. "You kept this secret for 4 years. 4 years. You made me believe he was my son, that we were family. Who is the biological father, Emily? I demand to know." Emily took a deep breath, knowing there was no hiding the truth anymore. "It's David," she finally admitted, almost in a whisper. "David, the man you saw with me last night. He's Jack's biological father." The revelation about Jack's real father was like a dagger in Richard's heart. David, an old acquaintance of Richard's, someone he considered a friend. The betrayal became even deeper and more unbearable. "David?" Richard's voice was full of disgust. "You were with him this whole time? You too kept this from me all these years?" Emily shook her head, desperate for him to understand. "It was just once, Richard. It happened before we were married. I never wanted him to know, I never wanted it to get out of our control. But after Jack was born, I knew. I knew he wasn't yours. So you lied to me, you lied about everything. You made me believe that we were a family, that everything was fine, while you were carrying this disgusting secret." Richard was shaking with rage. "You threw away our marriage, our life together, because of one night with him." Emily tried to get closer to Richard, but he backed away. "I loved you, Richard. I really did. I never wanted it to be revealed, I never wanted you to know. You loved no one but yourself." Richard shouted, feeling like a stranger in his own life. "You destroyed everything. And David? Does he know? Does he know that Jack is his son?" Emily hesitated for a moment before responding. "He knows. He knew a while ago, but we agreed not to tell you anything, to keep it between us. We thought it would be better this way." The admission was the final blow. Richard was silent, struggling to process the magnitude of the betrayal. He thought of Jack, the boy he had raised as his own son. How could he continue to be the father Jack knew, knowing that the boy was the result of such a profound lie. The silence between Richard and Emily lasted for what seemed like an eternity. The betrayal Richard felt was immeasurable, but what hit him most deeply was the pain of knowing that Jack, the child he loved more than anything, was not biologically his. He had always been a present, dedicated father, and now everything seemed like a cruel farce. Every moment with Jack, every smile, every hug, now carried an unbearable weight. How could he continue to be the father he always was, knowing the truth that now consumed him? Emily, in turn, was shattered. She knew she had ruined everything, that there was no excuse or explanation that could repair the damage done. But she also knew that, despite everything, she still loved Richard. She never imagined the consequences of her actions would reach this point, and now, all she wanted was a chance to fix what she had broken, no matter how impossible that seemed. "Richard, I know I hurt you in a way that is perhaps unforgivable," Emily began, her voice shaking. "But Jack loves you, he sees you as his father. To him, you're the only father he knows. I can't undo what I did, but we can get through this, we can try for Jack's sake." Richard looked at Emily with a mixture of disbelief and despair. "Get over this? How do you expect me to get over this, Emily? How do you expect me to look at Jack the same way, knowing what I know now?" Emily stepped forward, trying to meet Richard's eyes. "Because how you feel about Jack hasn't changed. He's still the same boy you always loved, who you raised. You're his father, Richard, no matter what. He needs you, now more than ever." Emily's words were true, but they brought no comfort. Richard knew his love for Jack wouldn't change, but the shadow of betrayal cast a darkness over everything. He wondered if he would ever be able to live with it, if he would ever be able to forgive Emily or himself for not realizing it sooner. "I need to think," he said finally, voice heavy with pain and exhaustion. "I need time to understand all of this, to decide what to do. But one thing is certain, Emily, our lives will never be the same." Emily nodded silently, knowing that any words at that moment would be in vain. She watched Richard leave the room, leaving behind not only the yellowed paper but also the pieces of a life he thought he had built. She knew that what had been broken would not be easily repaired, and perhaps never would be. But she also knew that she needed to fight, not just for herself, but for Jack, and for the man she still loved, despite everything. As Richard left the house, the approaching storm finally broke over Philadelphia. The sound of heavy rain hitting the windows seemed to echo the turmoil in his soul. He drove aimlessly through the wet streets, trying to find clarity amid the chaos of his thoughts. Everything he had built seemed to crumble around him, and he knew that when the storm passed, he would have to face the harsh reality of a future he never imagined. As he parked in a deserted park, Richard turned off the car and leaned his head against the steering wheel. He knew that the decision he would make in the coming days would define not only the future of his marriage, but Jack's as well. He needed to decide between what was right and what his heart said, but the two seemed irreconcilable. The truth was finally exposed, but the wounds it opened were deep, and the path to healing seemed distant and uncertain. The storm continued to rage, washing the city streets, but inside Richard, chaos persisted. The revelation of Emily's secret had devastated everything he believed in, and now he was alone to face the consequences, knowing that when the rain stopped, he would have to return home and face the reality that awaited him. The rain finally stopped when Richard returned home, but the weight he carried inside him was stronger than ever. Upon entering, the house was silent. Emily had already put Jack to bed, and the soft lights in the living room created a calm, almost deceptive atmosphere. She was sitting on the couch, her eyes red from crying. The environment seemed the same as always, but everything was irreversibly changed. Richard sat in the opposite chair, without saying a word. They both knew that this conversation would be decisive, but neither of them knew where to start. The silence between them was thick, full of everything unsaid, until Emily finally broke the ice. "I know you're hurt, Richard," she began, her voice soft and laced with regret. "And there are no words that can make amends for what I've done. I betrayed you in every way possible, and now I'm paying the price for it. But please think of Jack. He's not to blame for any of this. He needs of you, more than ever. Richard looked at Emily, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. You talk like it's easy, like I can just forget everything and carry on as if nothing happened. But how can I do that? How can I look at Jack and not see the lie you've built around us? Emily hesitated before responding. I know it's not easy, and I don't expect it to be. But, Richard, you're the father Jack knows. You've been there for every important moment in his life. Biology doesn't define what you are to him. What matters is the love you have for him, the time you spent together. Don't let my mistake destroy that. Emily's words resonated deeply with Richard, touching on a truth he tried to ignore. He knew that, despite everything, his connection with Jack was real. He was the man who had taught him how to ride a bike, who had helped him with his schoolwork, who had been there on nights when the boy had nightmares. Jack was his son, even if the blood said otherwise. But that same truth brought with it a moral dilemma that he didn't know how to resolve. How could he continue to be Jack's father knowing that another man was the biological father? How could he live with the lie, pretend that nothing had changed, when everything inside him was in pieces? And at the same time, how could he abandon the boy he loved as his own? This dilemma gnawed at Richard inside, and he knew that any choice he made would have devastating consequences. You're asking me to ignore everything, Richard said finally. To keep living a lie, for the greater good. But what about me, Emily? How can I keep living like this? How can I trust you again? How can I trust myself, knowing I've been deceived for so long? Emily swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Richard's words. I don't expect you to forgive me, Richard. I just hope you consider what's best for Jack. If you need time, if you need space, I understand. But please don't make a hasty decision. Jack deserves it. Have you in his life? Richard stood up, unable to remain seated any longer. He began pacing the room, trying to find a way out of the maze of emotions he was trapped in. Every step he took seemed to echo the dilemma that consumed him. On the one hand, the desire to protect Jack, to be the father he needed. On the other, the unbearable pain of betrayal, the doubt whether he would ever be able to overcome what he discovered. I need to think, he repeated, more to himself than to Emily. I need time to understand all of this, to decide what is right. Emily nodded, even though she knew this time could mean the end of their marriage. She watched him as he grabbed his coat and headed for the door, not knowing if he would come back. The sound of the door closing behind him was like a period in a painful but unfinished sentence. Richard left aimlessly once again. He knew he couldn't make such an important decision hastily, but he also knew he didn't have much time. Jack deserved to know the truth, but how could he tell it without destroying the boy? How could he look in the mirror and consider himself a father if he decided to walk away? The moral dilemma that tormented him was suffocating, and Richard felt as if he was trapped in a dead end. As he walked the streets of Philadelphia, Richard thought about all the lives he had defended in court, all the difficult decisions he had helped others make. But nothing in his career, nothing in his life prepared him to face this kind of choice. He was a man accustomed to dealing with facts, with unquestionable truths, but now he was trapped in a dilemma where there were no clear answers, only consequences. The darkness of the night seemed to reflect the state of his soul, and Richard knew that whatever choice he made, he would never be the same. Jack, Emily, and even himself, would be forever marked by that revelation. But as difficult as it was, he knew that at some point he would have to make a decision. A decision that would define not only the future of his family, but also who he was as a man and as a father. 3 weeks have passed since Richard left the house that night. Time dragged slowly, each day bringing new weights and questions that he didn't know how to handle. During this period, he isolated himself from everything and everyone, desperately searching for an answer to the dilemma that consumed him. Emily tried to contact him a few times, but he didn't respond. I needed space to understand the extent of what had happened and decide how to move forward. Finally, one cold afternoon, Richard made the decision that would change everything. He returned home, determined to face what he had avoided during those weeks. Upon entering, the house looked the same as always, but the atmosphere was charged, as if the air was thick and heavy. Emily was waiting for him in the living room, sitting tensely, knowing that the moment of truth had arrived. Jack was playing in his room, oblivious to the hurricane that was sweeping through his parents' lives. Richard sat across from Emily, looking at her with an expression that mixed sadness and resignation. "I've thought a lot about everything," he began, his voice low and controlled. "About you, about Jack, about what this means for us." Emily held her breath, waiting for the verdict she knew was coming. "And what have you decided, Richard?" He looked at the ground for a moment, as if searching for the strength to continue. "I can't go on with this, Emily. Not after everything. What you did, the lie you kept. It's something I can't forgive. But Jack, he's innocent in all of this. And as much as it destroys me, I can't abandon him. He's my son, regardless of everything." Emily closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of relief and pain. "I understand," she said, almost in a whisper. "I knew this day would come. You're a good man, Richard. Better than I deserve." "It doesn't matter anymore," he replied, his voice cold. "I'm going to file for divorce, but I want to make sure Jack knows the truth, in a way he can understand. He deserves to know, but he doesn't need to carry the weight of that secret. I will be present in his life, but we both know that our marriage is over." Emily nodded, tears silently streaming down her face. "I'll accept whatever you decide, Richard. All that matters is that Jack has a father, that he is loved and cared for." Richard stood up, feeling exhausted. He was about to leave when he heard the front door open. David entered the room, his unexpected presence freezing the air. He looked at Richard with a mixture of shame and guilt. "I came here because Emily told me what you know," David said, his voice low. I know there's no excuse for what I did. But I wanted to be here when you decided what to do about Jack." Richard stared at David with contained fury, but also with firm resolve. "You may be the biological father, David, but Jack is my son. I will be his father, and you will stay at a distance. If you try to interfere in his life, I will do everything necessary to make sure you never closer. He doesn't need two parents. He needs stability, and that's something you can never give him." David hung his head, defeated. "I understand," he said, accepting the truth Richard was imposing. The tension in the atmosphere was almost suffocating. Emily knew that this was the end of everything she had built, of all the lies she had supported. When David left, Richard turned to her one last time. "I hope one day you can forgive yourself, Emily," he said, his voice filled with bitter sadness. "But I can't be part of this life you chose. Our story ends here." Without waiting for a response, Richard left the house, knowing he was leaving behind a chapter of his life that could never be rewritten. He knew that the future would be difficult, that Jack would have questions and that the scars of that betrayal would stay with him forever. But he also knew he was making the right choice, the difficult but necessary choice. In the months that followed, Richard dedicated himself to rebuilding his life, focusing on Jack's well-being in his role as a father. He managed to keep the truth at bay, shielding Jack from the burden of knowing who his biological father was. Emily, in turn, accepted the consequences of her actions, now living with Richard's absence and the loss of the home she had destroyed. She knew that her life would never be the same and that the pain of the betrayal she caused would never be forgotten. The end was bitter for everyone, but it also brought resolution. Richard, although marked by grief, found the strength to move forward, dedicating himself to being the best father he could be to Jack. Emily, on the other hand, faced regret over her choices and the void they left. In the end, everyone paid the price for their decisions, and the truth, although devastating, brought with it the possibility of a new beginning, even if it was shrouded in shadows.